Hey everyone, settle in, because tonight we're diving into something absolutely ridiculous and completely fascinating about medieval Europe. You see, when you think about the Middle Ages, you picture castles, knights, feudal lords, maybe some grim monasteries where monks copy manuscripts and pray all day. But what if I told you that the single largest brewing operation in the entire medieval world wasn't run by some ambitious nobleman or wealthy merchant? What if it was the church, the Christian church? Yeah, the organization that's supposed to promote temperance and spiritual enlightenment was literally producing more beer than anyone else on the continent. It's wild. It's almost absurd when you think about it, but it's completely true. So before we get rolling, if you haven't already, drop a like on this video, because these historical contradictions really help the channel out. And seriously, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I genuinely love knowing who's tuning in from around the world. Maybe grab something to drink for this one, something warm ideally, and let's talk about how the church accidentally became medieval Europe's biggest brewery operation. When you picture a medieval monastery, you're probably imagining something pretty austere, right? Stone walls, rows of monks in silent contemplation, candle-lit rooms where the only sounds are prayers and the scratch of pens on parchment. And yeah, that was part of it. But you're missing a huge chunk of the picture, because alongside those scriptures being copied and those prayers being chanted, there was something else happening in the buildings behind the main chapel. Something that involved enormous vats, grain, yeast, and fire. Lots of fire. Monasteries weren't just spiritual centers, they were economic engines, and breweries were right at the heart of it. In fact, if you walk through a large monastery during the day, you'd see a level of industrial activity that might surprise you. Smoke rising from the brewery buildings, the sound of monks hauling grain, stirring massive pots, rolling barrels, storage rooms stacked with supplies, financial records being kept meticulously, people coming and going, delivering grain, picking up beer for trade or sale. It was busy. It was organized. It was very much a business operation, even if it was being run by men in habits who spent their mornings in prayer. Now, this probably seems shocking to modern ears. We live in an age where religious institutions are associated with sobriety, moral instruction, and abstinence. But in medieval Europe, things were different. Much different. The Catholic Church didn't oppose drinking. Not at all. In fact, the Church actually encouraged it. Wine was sacred. Jesus turned water into wine. Wine was literally the blood of Christ in communion. But here's the thing that gets interesting. Wine was expensive. Grapes grew mainly in the Mediterranean regions in southern France. If you were in northern Europe, in Britain or Germany or Scandinavia, getting good wine meant paying through the nose. Beer, though. Beer was different. Beer was local. Beer was plentiful. Beer was accessible. And beer was something monks figured out how to make really, really well. The question becomes, how did monks even get into brewing in the first place? It seems weird, right? These are men devoted to God, to prayer, to copying holy texts. Why would they be messing around with fermentation and barrels? But the answer is actually practical and kind of beautiful in a way. Monasteries were communities. They had anywhere from a dozen to several hundred monks, depending on the size and wealth of the monastery. These were people who needed to eat, and they needed to drink. The water in medieval times wasn't always safe. I know that sounds dramatic, but it's true. Rivers ran through towns that dumped all kinds of waste into them. Wells got contaminated. Disease spread through contaminated water. Dysentery, typhoid, cholera, decades before anyone understood what cholera actually was. The safest thing to drink was often beer or ale because the boiling process during brewing killed most of the pathogens. So monks weren't brewing for fun or profit at first. They were brewing because it was necessary for survival. It was practical. Honestly, it was genius in a way. They took a problem, contaminated water, and turned it into a solution, safe beer. But then something happened. Someone realized that monks were really good at this, that they could make consistent, reliable beer, that the rules and order of monastic life actually translated perfectly into the rules and order required for brewing. The discipline, the record keeping, the commitment to precision and repetition, all the things that made monks good at copying manuscripts also made them good at making beer. And maybe more importantly, they realized they could make money doing it. They could produce surplus, they could trade, they could sell. They could generate income for their monastery that could be used for charity, for construction, for buying books and religious materials, for supporting their spiritual mission. Everything changed once that realization clicked into place. Imagine you're a feudal lord in the year 1100, somewhere in what's now Germany. You're managing your lands, collecting taxes, keeping everything running. But there's a monastery not too far from you, maybe an hour's ride. And that monastery produces beer, not just for the monks themselves, but for sale. They sell it to local villages. They sell it to traveling merchants. They sell it to pilgrims heading to religious sites. They sell it everywhere. And because monks are running it, people trust it. There's a consistency to monastic beer that you don't get from random brewing operations. The monks have time. They have organization. They have commitment to quality because they're not just trying to make a quick profit. For many of them, this is their life's work. They might spend 20 or 30 years perfecting their brewing process. They experiment with different grains. They figure out optimal fermentation times and temperatures. They understand yeast in ways that most brewers at the time didn't. The monks kept detailed records. They wrote down recipes and procedures. This is crucial because information transfer was incredibly difficult in the medieval world. But in monasteries, information was preserved. It was copied. It was refined over generations. So when one monastery figured out a better way to brew beer, that knowledge could potentially spread to other monasteries. This created a kind of competitive improvement loop. Brewery techniques got better and better over centuries, and the profit margins were extraordinary. A monastery could buy grain cheaply because they controlled land and could grow it themselves or had favorable trading relationships with their local agricultural communities. The labor was essentially free because the monks were already living there, already eating, already existing as part of the community structure. They didn't need to hire workers or pay them market wages. So the cost of production was incredibly low, but the beer could be sold for actual money, real profit. This money then went back into the monastery. It funded construction. It funded the scriptorium where monks copied manuscripts. It funded charitable works. It funded the very infrastructure that made the monastery a center of spiritual and intellectual life. In a real sense, beer was funding the preservation of knowledge, the copying of important religious texts, and the intellectual and spiritual backbone of medieval European civilization. Not that the church probably wanted to advertise that fact, but it was true. By the 12th century, monasteries across Europe were generating serious wealth from brewing operations, and the real, Large, wealthy monasteries had operations that were producing thousands of gallons per year. Some monasteries were brewing on an industrial scale that wouldn't be matched by secular breweries for centuries. Here's what's wild about this. The church's dominance of brewing wasn't accidental. It was almost inevitable given the structure of medieval society. Monasteries had advantages that private brewers simply couldn't compete with, and I'm going to break them down because this is important to understanding how completely they dominated the market. First, land. Monasteries controlled enormous tracts of land. We're talking thousands of acres sometimes, passed to them through donations, through grants from noble families, through inheritance over centuries. They could grow their own grain, which meant they didn't have to buy it at market prices. They could also control the quality and type of grain being used in their brewing. They could plan ahead multiple years in advance, knowing what their grain supply would be. Try that as a private brewer. You're at the mercy of merchants, fluctuating prices, bad harvests. Second, infrastructure. Monasteries had already built substantial buildings for other purposes. Storage facilities, workrooms. They had running water from rivers or wells. They had the ability to heat water on massive scales. They had millstones for grinding grain. They had access to the best building materials. They could repair and maintain their equipment. Third, labor. While it's true the monks weren't paid in the modern sense, they were committed workers. They couldn't quit. They wouldn't strike. They worked because they were supposed to work, because it was part of their spiritual practice, because the monastery was their home, and because they were bound by monastic vows to obedience and labor. The continuity was incredible. You had skilled workers who stayed for decades, sometimes for life. Fourth, knowledge. Monks were educated. Many of them could read and write at times when the vast majority of the population couldn't. This meant they could preserve brewing knowledge in writing, share it with other monasteries through written correspondence and visiting monks, and improve techniques over time in documented ways. Knowledge accumulated. Recipes were refined. Mistakes were learned from systematically. Fifth, trust. People trusted the church. If a monastery said the beer was good, it was good. If a secular brewer said it, well, you had to wonder if they were cutting corners, if they were diluting the product, if they had the knowledge they claimed to have. This trust advantage was huge. It meant monasteries could charge premium prices for their product. People would pay more for monastic beer because they knew what they were getting. Because of these advantages, by the 1200s, monasteries weren't just locally important breweries. They were regional powers. Some of the largest monasteries in Germany, Belgium, and northern France were producing beer on scales that are genuinely hard to comprehend. We're talking about thousands upon thousands of gallons per year. The Benedictine monastery at Weihenstephan in Bavaria was brewing beer in such quantities that it became one of the largest beer producers in the entire region. And it kept that position for centuries. This wasn't a small operation. This was industrial. Historians have estimated that some large monasteries were brewing somewhere between 1 and 2 million liters of beer per year at the height of their operations. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the output of a decent-sized modern brewery. In medieval times, when there was no electricity, no temperature control, no automated equipment, this was absolutely staggering. These operations required massive wooden vats, multiple brewing buildings, sophisticated knowledge about grain handling, malting, fermentation, and storage. complex networks for distribution. It required money. It required organization. It required expertise. In other words, it required the kind of institutional structure that only the church could provide. When you look at the actual brewing operations that monasteries ran, what becomes clear is that this wasn't some hobby. These were serious businesses managed by people who knew what they were doing. Within most major monasteries, there would be a specific monk whose entire job was overseeing the brewery. This was an important position. This wasn't punishment duty. This was responsibility and authority. The brewery master, sometimes called the cellarer or the master of the brewery, would be respected within the monastery. He would answer only to the abbot. He would have control over resources. He would be making decisions about production, pricing, distribution. He might oversee a team of monks, sometimes 5 or 6 or more depending on the size of the operation, who worked in various stages of the brewing process. Some monks would handle the grain, testing it for quality, monitoring it in storage, preparing it for malting. Some would manage the malting, which is the process of soaking grain and letting it partially germinate and then drying it out. This was a crucial step that required precision and judgment. Get the malting wrong, and the whole batch could be ruined. You'd have wasted grain, wasted labor, wasted resources. Other monks would oversee the actual brewing, the boiling of the malt, the addition of hops or other herbs depending on the region and the era. Different regions had different preferences. German brewers favored hops early on. Belgian brewers might use different herbs entirely. Some monks would manage fermentation, watching temperatures, timing, knowing when a batch was ready. Some would handle bottling or the filling of barrels for distribution. This wasn't casual work. Mistakes were expensive. Waste was shameful, contrary to monastic values of stewardship and responsibility. So care was taken. Quality was maintained. The process was refined. And as generations of monks contributed their knowledge and experience to this work, the quality and efficiency improved measurably. But it wasn't just about the beer itself. Monasteries also had to manage the entire supply chain. They needed grain, which meant managing relationships with farmers or growing it themselves. They needed yeast, which they would cultivate and preserve carefully. They needed herbs and spices for flavoring. They needed containers, which were incredibly expensive and crucial for storage and transport. They needed to manage relationships with distributors, with merchants, with customers. Some monasteries actually employed lay workers to help with brewing and distribution. These weren't monks, but they were hired and paid to work for the monastery. This expanded the operation's capacity while still keeping it under monastic management and control. The scale of these operations is honestly difficult to fully grasp if you're not looking at specific examples. But let's talk about one. In 13th century Munich, there was a brewery that was run by monks associated with the Andechs monastery. By the late medieval period, this brewery was famous throughout the entire region. It supplied beer to courts, to merchants, to taverns, to nobles, to churches, to pilgrims traveling to religious sites. The quality was consistent and reliable. The price was fair. The distribution network was sophisticated. This brewery became so important to the local economy and culture that when Munich was eventually ruled by secular authorities, one of the first things they wanted to do was ensure the continuity of beer production and maintain the reputation that had been built. They actually valued the continuity so highly that some of the Bavarian purity laws regarding Bar composition can be traced back to the standards that monasteries had established centuries earlier. That's how central this monastery brewery was to the identity and economy of the city. This is one example among hundreds. In Belgium, the Trappist breweries that still exist today have direct lineage back to medieval monasteries. In Germany, nearly every major brewing center has roots in monastic beer production. In France, in England, in Scandinavia, monasteries were running breweries that ranged from substantial to absolutely massive. Some historians argue that monasteries were producing maybe 30 to 50% of all the beer consumed in medieval Europe at the height of monastic brewing dominance. Some estimates go even higher, particularly in regions like Germany and the Low Countries, where brewing was especially important. Think about that. The church, the institution devoted to spiritual matters and the salvation of souls, was responsible for somewhere between a third and half of all beer production on an entire continent. Every third beer or every second beer might have come from a monastery. It's absurd. It's contradictory. It's completely true. So why did this happen? How did an organization whose religious texts preach against excess and drunkenness become the largest producer of an intoxicating beverage? Part of it is practical, as we discussed. The church needed beer for its own communities, developed expertise, and found it was genuinely good at making it. But there's another part to this, and it's important. The church was also pragmatic, incredibly pragmatic. The church understood that it needed money to survive, to build cathedrals, to fund charity work, to feed the poor, to pay priests, to maintain the institution itself. Monasteries especially understood this. They had mouths to feed. They had buildings to maintain. They had land that required management. They had vows of poverty that meant they couldn't accumulate personal wealth. But the monastery itself needed resources. Brewing was a reliable way to generate that income. It fit perfectly with the agricultural basis of monastic life. It didn't require leaving the monastery or abandoning spiritual commitments. You could brew beer and still be a good monk. You could think of it as work, as labor offered to God, as part of your monastic vow to be productive and useful to the community and to society. The theological justification was sound. God gave you talents. You were supposed to use them. If you had land, you used it productively. If you had knowledge, you applied it. If you could make something valuable and sell it, then you were being a good steward. The church was also responding to massive demand. Medieval people drank beer constantly, not because they loved getting drunk necessarily, though intoxication definitely happened, but because beer was safe, because it provided calories and nutrients, because it was social and important to the functioning of society. Taverns were where people gathered and conducted business. Work was organized around drinking breaks and ale consumption. Celebrations involved beer. Funerals involved beer. Weddings involved beer. The first thing offered to a guest might be beer. Beer was woven into the fabric of medieval life at every level. The church recognized this and capitalized on it. There was no shame in that. There was no cognitive dissonance from the medieval perspective. Beer was food. Beer was medicine. Beer was necessary for basic survival and social functioning. The fact that monks were producing it just meant it was good quality. It was trustworthy. It was pure. These were monks, after all. They wouldn't cut corners or cheat. They were bound by vows of honesty and integrity. But as the medieval period progressed, and particularly as we get into the Renaissance and beyond, things started to shift. secular brewing operations began to improve and expand. Brewing knowledge spread beyond monasteries through trained workers leaving to start their own operations, through written knowledge becoming more available, through observation and imitation. Better equipment was developed by smiths and craftspeople working for wealthy brewers. New techniques emerged. Commercial breweries began competing seriously with monastic operations. By the 1500s and into the 1600s, the monastery's stranglehold on beer production was loosening noticeably. Other actors were entering the market. Towns were starting to regulate brewing through powerful guilds that set standards and controlled who could brew. Nobles were investing in their own breweries as status symbols and income sources. The economic and social conditions that had made monasteries dominant were changing fundamentally. Urbanization meant new centers of brewing power in cities. Improved transportation meant beer could travel farther and be produced more efficiently in certain regions. The Reformation also played a massive role, particularly in Northern Europe. In Protestant areas, monasteries were dissolved entirely. That was absolutely devastating to the brewing industry in those regions. Suddenly, all that institutional knowledge and infrastructure disappeared. Operations that had been running for centuries were shut down overnight. The knowledge that monks had preserved in writing sometimes survived, but the physical infrastructure and continuity of production were lost. In Catholic areas, monasteries continued to operate, but they faced new competition and new pressures. They also faced declining vocations as fewer people entered monastic life, which meant less labor available for brewing operations. By the 1700s, the age of the monastery brewery as the dominant force in European beer production was essentially over. It had been replaced by commercial operations, urban breweries, and noble breweries. But for roughly 800 years, from about the 6th century through the 14th century, and beyond in some places, the Church dominated European brewing. And the evidence of that dominance is everywhere if you know where to look. In old brewery names, in brewery locations, in brewing traditions that trace back to monastic origins. The Belgians have Trappist beers, beers brewed by monks in the Trappist tradition. Some of these beers are still made in monasteries today, using recipes and techniques that date back centuries. In Germany, the Bavarian beer culture that still defines that region has roots deep in monastic brewing traditions. Many old German breweries pride themselves on unbroken lineages back to monastery operations. These aren't just marketing claims. These are genuine historical connections. The monastery breweries didn't just disappear. They transformed. They secularized. They became regular breweries. But they kept the knowledge, the infrastructure, the buildings sometimes, the traditions. The legacy of the medieval monastery brewery is still visible in European beer culture today. What's fascinating about all this is how it reveals something about human nature and institutions. The Church didn't set out to become a brewing empire, but given the right circumstances, given the resources available, given the practical problems that needed solving, that's what happened. An institution devoted to prayer and contemplation became one of the greatest industrial operations of its time. It produced a massive economic benefit. It created jobs. It generated wealth that funded art, learning, and charity. It also, let's be honest, contributed to drinking culture in medieval Europe, which had its own consequences. Good and bad mixed together, as with most human enterprises. The monks weren't bad people for running breweries. They were pragmatic. They recognized an opportunity. They used skills and resources available to them. They created something of value. The beer was good. People wanted it. Society benefited. That's not a moral failing. That's just human beings figuring things out and doing what needed to be done. The strange story of how the medieval church became Europe's largest brewery is really a story about adaptation, about practical wisdom, about seeing opportunities where others didn't. It's about an institution that was flexible enough to engage in activities that might seem contradictory to its spiritual mission. Because sometimes survival and doing good work in the world requires pragmatism. Sometimes you have to make beer to fund your spiritual mission. And sometimes that beer becomes famous. Sometimes it becomes the thing people remember you for as much as your prayers. Sometimes the two things become so intertwined that it's hard to separate the monk from the brewer, the spiritual from the practical, the sacred from the secular. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's just what it means to be human, to build civilizations, to make institutions that are complex and contradictory, and full of unexpected legacies that echo down through centuries. The next time you drink a beer made in Germany or Belgium, the next time you encounter a Trappist ale or any beer with roots in European monastic tradition, remember that for nearly a millennium, the largest breweries in the world weren't commercial operations. They were run by monks, by religious communities, by men whose primary job was supposed to be prayer, but whose practical work fed and sustained their societies in ways that were profound and lasting. That history is wild, and it's real, and it's absolutely, unquestionably true.